Sentir Cubano it's our Cuban store. And it's called Sentir Cubano because you don't have to be born in Cuba to feel Cuban, you know? And that's why we name it Sentir Cubano, which is Cuban feeling, okay? Because I think even the kids that have been born here, second, third generation Cubans, they feel Cuban. We opened the store not as a store, but as a website called Cuban-American because we believe that nostalgia starts in the stomach. So this is how the business started, and we love it, and we really, you know, I don't know, it's like a passion that we feel for our country. And the store has become like an icon of our culture. When the Cubans come here, they feel that this is a part of them, and they're proud to show our store to the other people, show them our culture, because this is the Cuba before Castro. Everything here is in 1959, before 1959, up to 1959. Maps, T-shirts, the currency that it was then before, paintings. We even have a toilet paper with a Castro face on it. So, you know, everything, every little niche. And see, what makes our store different is that all the people that make things for our store are Cubans in exile, and they reflect their nostalgia and their love for Cuba, the things they do, and then they bring to us so we can sell. So that's what makes this store different, because there's a lot of passion and love for our country here. That it doesn't matter if you came 40, 50 years ago, or if you just got off the raft, you know. When they come here, they're Cubans. And when they come here and they see all of this, they're proud to be Cubans, see? Because we show them what Cuba was and what part of the history that the regime tried to not give them, and they don't even know about it. See, like Jose Marti, which is our Abraham Lincoln, you know. They they distorted the image of Marti.
Get kind of a guided tour of what the bathroom is about. You go walk.
Oh, you want me to walk in?
So, tell us about.
Okay, this bathroom is a special place because this is what maybe Cuba should look like if there was some freedom, you know? You see the graffiti on the walls, like Abajo Fidel. You see, for Cuba, para Cuba ya es hora. You also see the face of Che Guevara, which for us is a terrorist. No question about it. And of course, you see the funny touch of Raúl Castro. Okay. And then you have, which I think is the most important thing in the bathroom. If you go in, we have Castro's face, and he says, "Make your wish come true." And let me tell you, a lot of people have made their wish come true in this bathroom. I can assure you. There's so many Cubans, and because our roots here are so deep, you find a certain way of life. Let's say you have the organization of the Americans, but the flavor of the Cubans. So it's, the best of both worlds.
For more than 5 decades, Cubans fleeing in exile, seeking refuge, uprooted from their homeland, have made Miami home. Almost 1 million Cubans exiled from the island in the past 50 years, nearly 10% of the island's population. Miami, Florida, has become the first stop or the eventual stop for Cuban exiles and refugees. The fortunate fled in planes and boats, the desperate fled in rafts. By the year 1958, only about 10,000 Cubans lived in Miami, barely a fraction of the country. Today, persons born either in Cuba or of Cuban descent represent Miami's largest ethnic group and Miami-Dade County's largest demographic, recording at nearly half of all Hispanics in the county and 35% of the county's overall population. During the 1960s, Cubans concentrated in a region west of downtown Miami in a settlement pattern on the portion of Southwest H Street, a region which would later be coined Little Havana. But by the end of the first decade of the 21st century, Cubans could be found in great numbers throughout most of Greater Miami, including Hialeah, Westchester, Miami Lakes, Miami Springs, Doral, Sweetwater, Miami Beach, Kendall, Homestead, and Coral Gables.
I think being a Cuban in Miami is not the same as being a Cuban in California or a Cuban in New York. Being Cuban in Miami, you're constantly being exposed to the Cubanness, to Cuban America.
Miami is a signature city.
Miami is a lot of things, but it is definitely very Cuban.
We are, in essence, an extended province of Cuba. You can see here in Miami sort of what Cuba would have been had Fidel not taken power.
Miami was revolutionized. There's no denying that. Miami was revolutionized by Cubans.
Cuban Americans made Miami what it is today. I think that nobody would argue against that.
What Cubans have done in Miami has been mainstream.
The Cuban Exile group transformed Miami from a sleepy vacation town to a major metropolitan area.
The Cuban impact and influence in Miami is unrivaled in American history. No immigrant group has had the same level of impact on any specific area than Cubans have had in Miami.
The growth of Miami and the growth of the Cuban community as far as power or position politically, economically, professionally, it's really a story to be told.
As Cubans arrived in masses over the years, they began to create a home away from home in diaspora, with thoughts of not returning to Cuba anytime soon because of the country's political and economic situation growing more entrenched. Cuban immigrants went to work in raising their families, receiving their education, participating in local and civic duties, and building their businesses in the greater Miami region. Within a few years, Cubans built an enclave in the heart of Miami and have risen with power and influence over the years. A once minor ethnic group of immigrants that used Miami as a tourist destination during the days of pre-communist Cuba, Cubans have emerged as a powerful immigrant community in one of America's major urban cities.
This is home base. And so when people look at Miami, they look at the capital of the Cuban exile.
I don't think that there's a simple answer as to why Miami became so Cuban. I think it was pretty the perfect storm.
Let's be blunt. Which is what? Obviously, you want. Do Cubans run Miami? That's essentially what we're trying to get to, I think. I would say yes.
Yeah, we put the city on the map. Everybody knows about Miami, and usually Miami is You know, when you think of Miami, you think of all the crazy Cubans over there.
There's a school of thought that tells you that Miami would have grown anyway without Cuban Americans, and that's probably the case. But the point is not that. The point is that it was Cuban Americans that made the city grow. That's reality. That's history, for better or for worse.
Miami is proud of the fact that we built the city. You know, we're an immigrant people that came in here, assimilated, and took what was there and made it better. And as we made it better, made it with our own tinge, our own flavor, our own heritage, our own identity, the Cuban identity.
They made Miami a success story worldwide. Miami has become the key to Latin America. Miami has become one of the most important cities in the United States.
You have to be careful. You have to be careful in minimizing the Cuban contribution and also exaggerating the Cuban contribution.
The history of Miami shows you had a boom in the 20s. You had a boom right after World War II when the soldiers all came back, and then you had the boom again back in '59 when the Cubans came here.
There are some sociologists that have argued that Miami is qualitatively different from many immigrant cities in the sense that the Cubans have here in Miami created what is called an institutionally complete ethnic enclave.
An enclave would be an area where number one, there will be a very high concentration of people of a certain ethnicity. And not only that, but also economically speaking, the businesses as well. And those businesses hiring mostly people of that ethnic background. You could say that at this point, the whole Miami-Dade area is a Cuban enclave.
Key to the enclave is that you have some poor working class, some non-poor working class, some professionals, and you have a pyramid where you have some rich people from that very same group. So that you hire your own all the way down. So in Miami, that has happened. The Cubans have reproduced a class structure, and the class structures are hard to overturn.
Living in Miami, it's tough not to live in an enclave. It's an area that's very culturally diverse, but there's pockets of people. And where I grew up, and in the high school I went to, for example, 98.9% of everybody from my class was Cuban. So my teachers were Cuban, our janitors were Cuban, the kids that sat next to me were Cuban. So it was very much like we were still in Cuba, except that we spoke English.
You know, Cubans, when they exiled, they mostly stayed in Miami. A lot of people went to New Jersey. A lot of people went to Tampa, where there was already a Cuban community there because of the cigar factories and what have you. A lot of folks went to Puerto Rico. There's a big Cuban community in Puerto Rico, a big Cuban community in Madrid, in Spain. But most of the people were here in Miami. And I think that you think Cuban American and you think Miami. I mean, Miami is the epicenter of Cuban American culture.
Miami is the world. You know, it's like there's a wall around South Florida. Now it's extended into Broward. You know, that's uncharted territory until a few years ago. I'm an exile from Cuba and I'm an exile from Miami, so I'm sort of a double exile.
Miami is almost a little appendage of Cuba.
Some people tell you from Palm Beach down or from Broward County line down, there's a whole different country. You hear that all the time. You know, people come to, oh, you're the mayor of that country called the city of Hialeah. If you and I get in the car and we drive 15 minutes north and in Pembroke Pines, change completely to what it is here. Completely. If we drive 30 minutes south and we're in Florida City, completely different.
You go 2 hours from here is another country.
After Havana is the city with the largest concentration of Cubans anywhere else in the world.
Miami is the Mecca for the Cubans.
You feel more Cuban in Miami than in Cuba.
The Cuban that comes in, that still has that mentality of, I'm still in Cuba, can come to Miami and sort of find their niche of what they had.
Miami is Cuba outside Cuba. It's as simple as that. Cubans here have been able to basically introduce many of the things that were characteristic of the Cuban culture. Here in Miami, you don't miss almost anything from Cuba. You can go from cradle to grave here in the Cuban way.
In all aspects of life, in business, in economics, in politics, in art, in architecture, construction, in all aspects of life, I think Cubans have very much shaped Miami. Not only the city of Miami, but Miami-Dade County, period, which a few years ago was Metro-Dade County.
That enclave was created an insulating force for Cuban culture, for the language, the Spanish language.
The contribution of the Cubans, again, is so immeasurable and so significant that it's forever etched in everything Miami is. There's nothing more that could be done.
In 50 years, it has been a very successful community. It has succeeded in everything except the one thing it came to do, which was to overthrow Castro.
It was the eve of January 1st, 1959, when a nearby country's political life was overtaken by a man and his rebel group. Sooner than later, a country of citizens fled their beloved homeland. Within the span of the next 3 years, the region of Miami faced hurricane-force-like waves of immigration, which immediately brought approximately 200,000 Cuban exiles. The first to leave the island immediately after the Castro-led revolution were those affiliated with the past dictator, Fulgencio Batista, and his regime and his supporters. This wave of early Cuban immigrants was later nicknamed Batistianos. Soon after, wealthy and established Cubans and Cuban families followed the Batistianos in exile. Seeing their businesses nationalized, property seized, bank accounts frozen, assets confiscated, and valuables taken away by the new Cuban government. Cuba's educated and prosperous upper and middle classes and later professional working class, all exiled from the island and immediately populated in masses to an undeveloped Miami scene. The first wave of Cuban exiles to Miami have often been considered and labeled the Golden Exile. This wave of immigrants consisted of Cuba's wealthy elite and privileged class, which would later become the first generation to help in reshaping the cultural, political, economic, and social life of the city of Miami.
The first wave of Cuban immigrants was basically the entire Cuban bourgeoisie.
Cuban Americans came, the butcher, baker, and candlestick maker, but the doctor, the professor, the teacher, the middle-class businessman, the entrepreneur, we came with a parish priest, for Christ's sake. So we came with a pre-constructed society, a culture, grouping.
They came in with political capital, turned that into economic capital and social capital. And that's what gave rise to the enclave in the 70s.
Some of them came with money, some of them came with influence, but a lot of them came with knowledge. And they came into a situation where Miami was small enough where they could make a difference, small enough where they could leave their stamp, and they could create something out of nothing.
If you study history of for example, the Italian, the German, the Irish immigration, usually the first generation goes to work. The second generation goes to school, and the third generation starts getting power, political power, and that has not been the case with the Cubans. The Cubans have been here about 50 years. 50 years is probably a generation and a half. And in that generation and a half, they have accomplished all those things. Of course, they went to work. And of course, they were able to get their kids to school, but at the same time, they have actually conquered political power.
They also came with a great deal of support, and I don't mean just financial, but a great deal of favorable conditions with respect to the U.S. government. That is, the U.S. government largely, unlike a lot of other say, Latino immigrants to the U.S. government did favor at that time in the 60s the immigration of Cubans. They not only had a program of assistance and of resettlement for Cubans who came in and had no jobs and so forth, but also they came under refugee visas. In other words, essentially anyone who left Cuba during those years in the 60s and 70s and who came to the United States was admitted. And given a refugee visa, eventually given the residency, and allowed to stay in the United States. So there was a favorable, what we call a favorable context of reception, both economically in terms of the city they came to, and also in terms of policies and immigration policy. So those things, in many ways, helped out. The fact that they had these human capital factors, that they were managers, et cetera, meant that they were poised to take advantage of a lot of opportunities in Miami.
I think that people should just accept that once upon a time, Cuban people are very, again, they're just very proud people. They came here, they did the best they can do, and it proved to me more than enough. And that's why, we have this great city, Miami.
When you look at the numbers of Cubans here, then they even have a better chance because they're more Cubans than anybody else. So if you go into politics and the Cubans are voters, because you're gonna get in.
One of the greatest advantages that the Cuban American community has had is that our diaspora has a capital, and a capital in which we are the majority.
Between 1960 and 1962, over 14,000 children of Cuban families were sent from the island to Miami through numerous plane trips conducted with the collaboration of the CIA, the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Miami, and various Cubans in Miami and on the island. The operation, which later became known as Operation Pedro Pan, was designed to transport the children of parents who opposed the new Cuban government, but later expanded to include children of parents concerned by rumors that their children would be shipped to labor camps in the Soviet Union.
Basically, the purpose was to take children out of Cuba in order to save them from communism. And our parents were very, very nervous about the events that were taking place on the island. They were not sure where the policies were going, and they elected to send us away, thinking on most cases that it was going to be a very short-lived exile, and it turned out not to be so. To pick a child from a home and send the child to a foreign land, it's a very serious decision. And not only were we alone, we were 14,000 of us that left in a period of close to 2 years. Not quite, but close to 2 years. And as a result of that, thousands of people left afterwards because our parents, our uncles, our brothers, our sisters, they left afterwards. I think it was the beginning of the real exodus of Cubans. Started with Pedro Pan, and then it continued with our families, and then it continued with all other people. So I think when you look back at this story, I think the Pedro Pan children will have played a significant part of the history.
In the beginning of October 1965, the Cuban government announced that the port of Camarioca would be opened for any Cuban who wanted to leave the country for the Yankee paradise, and for boats of Cuban exiles that wished to return to Cuba to evacuate relatives. Camarioca remained open until mid-November of 1965. Almost 3,000 Cubans took advantage of Castro's offer during the time the port remained open. Soon after, the port of Camarioca was closed, the U.S. and Cuban governments began negotiations of airlifts taken by officially chartered passenger vessels to Miami. These airlifts, famously coined the Freedom Flights, began in December 1965 and operated as twice daily flights from Havana to Miami. The last of the Freedom Flights ended in 1973. During the 8-year period, approximately 260,000 Cubans migrated to the U.S., making it the largest of all the waves of Cuban migration to the United States.
What my mother instilled in us was that this transition was going to be temporary because, as she called it, as soon as Fidel falls, that famous phrase in Spanish that every Cuban knows, cuando se caiga Fidel, you know, you say, oh, cuando se caiga Fidel, you know, you're going to go back to Cuba. So that was always the thing, you know. So we came here knowing that it was 12 years of communism back then, and that any minute now, Fidel was going to fall and we were going to go back to Cuba. So we were like looking forward to that. So every year I would say to my mom, ¿Cuándo se va a caer Fidel? When is Fidel falling? And my mother would say to me, soon, he's going to fall soon. And, you know, here we are 50 years later.
Our frame of mind of Miami was, you know, a vacation spot. And when we came, the first 6 months, we were on vacation here, even though we were going to school.
The difference between an exile and an immigrant is that while immigrants look forward, exiles look back.
The refugee mentality is, I've got to figure out a way to survive. And they're always thinking they're going to go back. And you never really take ownership of a community if you're always thinking you're going to go back. That's changed, and I think it's part of the maturation of Miami.
I feel like I grew up in a city as the city grew up.
If you know Cubans, you would know that Miami is not an intended project. And you can't get 1 million Cubans to agree, let's take over Miami. That's crazy. It's something that happened extemporaneously.
I think it was created out of necessity and out of circumstance and haphazard. I don't think there was a plan.
Miami stopped being an American city, I would say, by the 70s, late 70s. You know, by that time, it was very much a tropical, you know, Caribbean city.
Miami is a Caribbean city. You know, it's very much so a Caribbean city. It's not like Havana, very different from Havana, very different from San Juan, very different from Port-au-Prince, very different from Santo Domingo, very different from any other Caribbean city. However, there are elements that make it very much a Caribbean city.
Where you drive down the street, everything's in Spanish and everything's Cuban, and you got the guayaberas and you got non-Hispanics that come over here and they wear the guayabera, and then you got politicians who come over here and they want to try the Cuban coffee.
O sea, aquí te puedes dar el lujo de hablar en inglés mal, pero lo que no te puedes dar el lujo es de no hablar español. Entonces el lenguaje, además de ser español, es cubano.
Miami, you just breathe cubanía. You just breathe the cubanía here. You know, and if you don't believe me, I can take you to Little Havana, or I can take you to Hialeah, or I can take you to Westchester, or I can take you to Kendall, I can take you to Coral Gables, I can take you to Miami Beach, I can take you to Aventura, where there's a big Cuban Jewish community, the Cubans. I can take you all throughout Miami, and you will feel that this is a big slice of Cuba.
Miami is the capital of all Latin America within the United States. I usually joking say that, but not so joking, I say that Miami is the best Latin American country because it is in American soil. And, under the American flag and an American soil. To go to Georgia, you don't have to actually fly, you can drive.
The way business is done in Miami is very much reminiscent of the Caribbean, Latin America, for lack of a better term, third world country. The way relations are united, the way relations are used in business and in society is very much similar to the way it's done in other countries, not how it's done in the United States. The way people move here, not necessarily physically move, but how they go about their business, I think is very Caribbean and very distinct from the rest of the United States. So all those things, which is what give Miami, I think, a very particular identity, is why I call it the Republic of Miami.
As exiles from Cuba fleeing the communist regime arrived in Miami in the early 1960s in large numbers, the U.S. federal government used the Freedom Tower, a historic 1925 landmark building located in downtown Miami, as a facility to process, document, and provide medical and dental services for the newcomers. With tens of thousands of Cubans processed and provided for through the Freedom Tower during the 1960s and 1970s, Cubans certainly made United States their new country and Miami their capital.
The Freedom Tower, to many Cubans, is like the Statue of Liberty is to many children of immigrants that came through New York. And I think the reason that's such a powerful, transformative symbol is because the Freedom Tower became something bigger than itself. It became a point of entry.
Hundreds of thousands of folks were processed there. That's where our family members would go to get the canned meat and the canned cheese and the peanut butter. Today, I know they're processed in a very different way. INS and ICE and all these things. But I feel we can't forget the humanity of why people are coming over here.
The Freedom Tower is the most iconic building in Miami. It is Miami's signature building. It's a place that is revered by Cubans especially because in the early 60s, the federal government leased the building for 10 years, and it served as the refugee center for Cubans who were arriving. As a matter of fact, when I arrived in Miami, the next day, the place that I had to go to be registered and processed as a refugee was the Freedom Tower. So it has an emotional value to us. And that was a place where you would go to register, they would do a medical checkup. More than 600,000 Cubans were processed through the Freedom Tower. It's an icon. And it's a building that represents, just that freedom. I will tell you, the Freedom Tower is our Ellis Island of Miami.
After the Peruvian embassy break-in in Havana, Cuba in 1980, 10,000 Cubans immediately stormed the embassy grounds, seeking asylum out of the country. Seeing an opportunity to what Castro considered flushing the toilet of Cuba's filth, the Cuban government opened up the port of Mariel for all Cubans who wanted to leave the island. Along with that order, Castro freed the prisons and sent detained criminals on open boats with tens of thousands of Cubans seeking to leave Cuba. Cubans living in Miami and elsewhere rented out and brought along tugboats, yachts, shrimpers, and anything else that could float to Cuba's Mariel harbor for the tens of thousands of Cubans ready to leave the island. The mass exodus of Cubans, which later would be called the Mariel boatlift, deported approximately 125,000 Cubans into the Miami region within a 7-month period. The Marielitos, as they were called, consisted of the working and poor class of Cuba's economy and were more representative of the island's diverse makeup, including a large number of black and non-white Cubans.
It was an entire process, from the time I left my house by myself, even though I was 16 years old, I was underage. They picked me up by myself. They held me for like 5 days at a place called Cuatro Ruedas, where all the minors were being held. And then a few days later, they took us to the Mariel boat, the port of Mariel. And at the time, I thought that my mother had already left the country, until someone told me, "Hey, your mother is still in Varadero. She hasn't left the country." It had been 10 days since I left my house. So basically, I changed my mind about leaving the country. I said, forget about it. I'm not doing this. I'm going back. I remember a friend of mine telling me, "You cannot go back. You cannot go back. Can't go back to Varadero. You have to leave. Your mother is already in Miami." I said, "No." They told me she's not. She's back home. Anyways, it was an entire ordeal. And all of a sudden, they called my name. They started calling names because they had all the passports, and they called my name. They called my friend's name. So one way or the other, I ended up, in a big yacht, departing for Miami all by myself, with my friend, and there were about 15 women that had just been released from women's prison. And we were in the middle already of the ocean on the Florida Strait when, I heard my name. Someone was calling my name, "Hugo, Hugo," from far away. And I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. And I'm like, where's this coming from? And then I hear my friend Lucy upstairs, Monica, so that's my mother's name, Monica, and she says, tu hijo quería renunciar, I got your son, he wanted to go back. So I found my mother in the middle of the ocean, 15 days later after I left my hometown with my sister. So, it was an incredible story. And when I arrived in Key West, I thought I had been dreaming. It was a very emotional moment, but we finally found each other after 15 days, and we ended up in our first home in Miami, which was the Orange Ball. That's where we spent the first 15, 20 days of our stayed here in Miami.
Miami was an extremely volatile place in 1980. We had the McDuffie riots. Right after the first waves of the Mariel, there were still tent cities all over the place. It was the height of the cocaine cowboys. There were Colombian gangs that were tearing up houses, shooting people. You would go to nightclubs and there would be people snorting coke in the bathrooms openly. It was crazy. It was like the wild, wild west. So then you inject 125,000 Cubans, some of them who have family that will sponsor them, and many of them who don't, or don't know how to get in touch with family. And they're in tent cities under the highways, in the Orange Bowl, they're all over the place. It was 12 days of rioting, and people were being killed, and things were Miami was burning up. You could just look and see the plumes of smoke off of, all over Liberty City and over town. And then there's all these tent cities. So it was an insane, crazy place. And what happened was they started shipping a lot of the Mariel that were unsponsored to Miami Beach. Miami Beach was a dive, all these cheap hotels, lots and lots of cheap apartments. Nobody was interested in Miami Beach in 1980 at all. It was all run down. And they were, taking bus loads across the causeway and just putting them in these, and every day there would be people in the street in Miami Beach dead, just turning up dead.
Arriving in Miami in the middle of the turmoil of the Mariel boatlift in 1980 was a very interesting experience. We lived in Miami Beach, in South Beach, in a very, very, very small studio apartment, or efficiency as they called it at the time. And I slept on the floor for over a year, 2 years, and it was interesting. I went to Miami Beach High. My sister went to another school. We lived in 5th and Collins Avenue. It was a lot of delinquency, a lot of crime there at the time, and so forth and so on. And it was we were discriminated against, not only because we were lived in a poor neighborhood, but also because we were the so-called Marielitos, at the time. Even our own Cuban people that had been here for a longer period of time, looked at us like, hey, here comes the Marielito guys, be careful and so forth. But it was a great experience. It was the experience, I guess, of any immigrant from any country that arrived in a foreign country. But it was difficult for me and my mother and my sister because we had no relatives, we had nobody, we didn't know anybody here.
In the summer of 1994, tens of thousands of Cubans fled the island on homemade rafts, inner tubes, and flimsy vessels, heading for the Florida Straits. The exodus was triggered by the deterioration of the Cuban economy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In September 1994, after more than 35,000 balseros had been rescued by the U.S. Coast Guard and detained at the U.S. Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay, the U.S. and Cuban governments entered into secret negotiations of immigration policy. The 1994 and 1995 immigration accords effectively stopped the 1994 balseros crisis. Since 1995, the U.S. government has set up a quota of 20,000 immigrant visas annually for Cubans. Of this number, 5,000 would come from a lottery system. This special lottery, administered by American officials in Havana, Cuba, gives Cubans permanent U.S. residency. Through factors of how to retain a visa, a green card, and eligibility status, the U.S. federal government has provided legal access for Cubans to enter the country and eventually call it home. This system has been the legal route for recent Cuban exiles throughout the mid to late 90s and the entire decade of 2000.
A través de una balsa que hicimos 4 personas y compramos un motor, hicimos todo un movimiento en Ciudad de La Habana para poder salir y después de 3 días en el Golfo de México llegamos acá a los Estados Unidos un 25 de febrero del 2005. ¿Por qué también? Porque estaba supuesto, como teníamos un motor, estaba supuesto a llegar un poquito más rápido. Lo que pasa es que no contábamos que el motor a las 60 millas se iba a romper. Entonces vieron 30 millas, o sea, a 60 millas, vieron 30 millas, 60 millas exactamente, disculpa. 30 millas salimos, 60 millas que hubo que remar. Y ahí empezó la historia mía acá en los Estados Unidos. Y entonces así es como yo salgo del proceso de balsero a incorporarme a la sociedad en Miami.
How bad is it in Cuba that would make you leave your wife and kids or put them on a raft with you, not knowing if you're going to make it, get on a little raft and go into the unknown terror, knowing people have died and have not made it, empty rafts floating on the ocean, not knowing if you're going to make it. How bad is it over there that you're so willing to risk everything you got left, your life, to hopefully get a piece of what is being offered over here? That's that value. That's that strive. If you get on that raft and you make it over here, you're going to get here and you're going to do something with what you do over here.
Over 90% of the Cubans living in Miami identify themselves as white. The majority of Cuba is of Black African descent. Anthropologists and sociologists use the term chained migration to explain the difference in race relations in Miami compared to the island amongst Miami's largely diverse Cuban population. Chained migration refers to the process of foreign nationals immigrating to a new country under laws permitting their reunification with family members already living in the destination country. In the case of the Miami immigrant story, since a large portion of white Cubans from middle to upper class backgrounds make up the first wave of migration to Miami, the second wave will tend to repeat that phenomenon. If Black Cubans or other poor non-white Cubans don't make a significant portion of a migration move, there will not be a tendency for Black or poor non-white Cubans to come as a continuing force in migration. Plus, with the fact that predominantly white Cubans migrate to and reside in Miami, a lot of displaced and desperate Blacks on the island find it daunting to make the move to Miami.
The only Cuban place where Black are not visible is here in Miami.
Not so many people, Black, left the country.
Most Cubans are in Miami. So what you don't see in Miami, you won't see anywhere else. So if you don't see Black Cubans in Miami, you won't find it in New Jersey or any other one. So this is what it is.
It almost seems as if the white part of the Cuban society is more eager to leave.
A great many of the very first migration to Miami were white or lighter skinned, and it was this kind of upper echelon of society. And then so what made the news and what kind of presented itself on a large scale were these whiter, more European, more lighter skinned people.
From the 1959 to, let's say, 80s, these communities was made by whites. So when you talk here about Cubans, you are talking only about white Cubans. I said that at that point, they made real a dream they always had in Cuba. A dream that came from the 19th century for the big ideology, how we can have Cubanness without blacks.
Desde el punto de vista racial, esa comunidad, que fue la primera que se estableció en Miami, venía
con ese elemento subyacente que es racial y que no pueden negarlo, evidentemente porque venía con la historia de la propia naturaleza de Cuba.
The Europeans conquered everywhere. They conquered in the Americas, they conquered in Africa, they conquered in Asia. And they brought with them the idea that white is better. And I feel that most people bought it hook, line, and sinker. And I feel that around the world, white is considered better. And I think that when it comes to Cubans, they almost get offended when people don't think they're white, when people call them Hispanic as a race.
We were, as the saying goes, lily white, or we thought ourselves as lily white.
You know, Cubans get called out a lot on the race question because Cubans make these grand pronouncements about racism that other communities don't make. So you'll hear Cubans say, well, there was no racism in Cuba before Castro. Well, of course there was racism in Cuba before Castro. We have it. There was a race war in Cuba in the early 20th century. So clearly there was racism and racial tensions prior to Castro's revolution. Now the flip side is then you have Castro's government and certain Cubans saying, well, we fixed the race, which is just as an extreme and ridiculous statement, that there is no longer racism on the island. There definitely is racism on the island of Cuba. When you look at who has political power, when you look at who's in leadership positions, even if you look at, frankly, hotel and tourist workers who make the best salaries on the island because they have access to tips, they have access to tourists, they're overwhelmingly light-skinned. Right? And you have black Cubans in more agricultural jobs. I mean, there's definitely still racism on the island. And I think, of course, that also transplants itself into the U.S. when Cubans come to the U.S. But one's not better or worse, but I feel like in Latin American and Caribbean countries that there's more room to identify in terms of your race. And here it's black or white.
With race understandings in the Caribbean and the United States, it's very different. I mean, I think that in the United States, it's always been white and black, and now there's like a little room for brown, and brown is supposed to be Mexicans. But, you know, I'm not brown, but I'm Latina, and I do consider myself of color.
Whenever I go to a market, if I go with my hair like this or I braid my hair, they always talk to me in English. And it happens to my sister, and it happens to my brother. You know? So it tells you that people, oh, okay, we're in a Hispanic community, but they still judge by your appearances, you know what I mean? So that has a lot to do with the Romans. Sometimes some people settle here from Cuba and they immediately become Americanized in terms of, okay, I'm lighter skin, you're darker skin.
It's almost like people don't know how to deal with me if I say that I'm Cuban. They don't know what to say, they don't know how to identify, they don't know, I think they just don't know how to deal with me. And the funny part is, it's just like, I'm human, deal with me as a person.
We'll go to the supermarkets and I'm at the checkout counter and you see the little old lady, you know, Cuban little old lady, and I have to say Cuban because I knew, you know, from the accent, you know, okay? Cuban, okay? And she's, you know, and she's asking, it's a very, very difficult, you know, heartbroken, you know, broken English, trying to, you know, help me. And I'm like saying back to her in Spanish, and she's like, oh, you speak Spanish? And I would say, of course I speak Spanish, and I also speak Italian, and I speak French and Portuguese, and what else do you want me to speak? You know, and that kind of, right away, getting nervous. So where are you from? I say, I'm from Cuba, I'm from the same place you're from.
Let's just say that there's a lot of skeletons in the closet with issues of race and Cubans.
I don't think it's a secret. I really do think that Cubans are racist.
Racism here, when you know, and it does exist, by the way.
Existe un racismo solapado por detrás. Mientras a ti no te toca, tú no eres racista.
That people that came over here still have some racism, I can say, and don't open totally, don't treated the same way that for white people than the black people.
I never experienced the type of racism that I have experienced here. Here is raw, it's up in your face. You know, the looks, you know, and sometimes you have people that will approach you, you know, to ask you, you know, like who you are and, you know, make sure like maybe you're in the wrong place. It's there's nothing subtle about it.
Historically, the wealthy and privileged Cubans on the island before the 1959 Cuban Revolution were predominantly white Spaniards of first and second generation. So the hundreds of thousands that left Cuba in the 2 decades following the revolution now living in Miami are of recent Spanish descent. However, recent Cubans that have come in the past 30 years have blended into the melting pot rainbow family that is of Cuban ethnicity, which makes up the majority of the island nation.
There has been a lot of Africans in Cuba who have married within the Cuban people, and then they have children that are darker and darker in skin. So in other words, the whole marriage or the whole mix of the race and becoming African Cuban is not just something that goes back generations to generations. The African Cubans are also very current and very recent.
If you're Cuban, you're white. But in fact, majority of Cubans aren't white.
If one were to go to Cuba right now and never have gone before, you would say, wow, this is a really African country. Because the city, like 70% of the people in the city are definitely dark-skinned, like very dark to mixed.
La mayoría de la población cubana es negra.
What I say, 30% is black, more or less, 30% is like say mulatto, and 30% is white. Don't look for the grandmother.
Cubans have a saying that they say, "Y tu abuela dónde está?" which means where's your grandmother? And it's for, you know, when someone who clearly has African blood will say, "Oh no, my family came from Spain. You know, we're European, and then we came to Cuba. I can trace my family." People will say, "Well, ¿y tu abuela dónde está?" Almost saying, you know, you're hiding your African ancestry.
You don't take away that there is a big, well, it's one of the largest races in Cuba of blacks, and blacks look like other blacks.
It's the shock. You know, it's the explanation that they can't believe it, as though, like, you know, there were no black Cubans in Cuba. Or the only black Cuban that we recognize is Celia Cruz. Come on.
At least the Brazilian understands that there's an Afro-Cuban, or I mean an Afro-Brazilian in their country. But the Cuban doesn't want to say that because, again, I mean, it's 90 miles away, but it's the furthest thing from us.
The closer you are to white, the better it is. And Cubans love to boast that we're not racist. And Cubans are racist, my friend, in their practices.
Well, I do understand, and I do feel there's discrimination, you know, in this town, especially, and you could. That is a very obvious thing to notice. You know, again, as I said, just walk the streets of Miami, go to the most prominent places in Miami, the best restaurants, the best nightclubs, the best cafeterias like Versailles and so forth and so on, and see how many black people have you seen, you know, our Café Versailles on TV protesting against Fidel Castro. You don't see those, you know, so, you know, but they're here. Well, they're here. I mean, there's a lot of black Cubans in Miami.
The first noticeable presence of Afro-Cubans in a migration from Cuba is in Mariel. In 1980, in fact, Mariel is still the only wave of migration that has significant representation of Afro-Cubans. In the Rafters later, for example, and in those that are coming through the intersection, there's also an underrepresentation of blacks for several reasons. For some reason, on the Rafters, it seems that the typical Rafter overall is a white urban male, and not so many Afro-Cubans, for whatever reasons, dynamics internally to Cuba, that is. Also, in the migration through the intersection, through the normal visa process of 20,000 visas a year, that also has a predominantly much more white population for whatever reasons those are. So it's still the case. Mariel is still the wave in which the non-white population was significant, and some people think up to 50%. I'm not sure if that was as high as that, but somewhere along those lines.
If we go back to Cuba, the experience of race in Cuba, even prior to the revolution, it's very different from the United States. If you take it all the way back into the 19th century, in terms of free blacks as opposed to enslaved blacks, and what were the conditions, you even have sort of slaves that didn't belong to anybody but the king. I mean, so there were all these sort of different historical circumstances in terms of the way race was constructed. Not to say it wasn't racist, of course it was. There was no Jim Crow, per se. There was more of a social knowing where the lines were, but the lines were not legally binding. There were laws against intermarriage and so on, biracial, multiracial kinds of marriage allegiances. Those were, everybody worked around those as well. So there's a very different sort of historical notion, historical approach to race, and then you bring that into the American context, and it's doubly so. But absolutely, I mean, Cuban Americans, Mariel is a great example. During the Mariel boatlift, I mean, a lot of Cubans in Miami, Cuban Americans, whichever way they might want to identify, there was real surprise and a real sort of rejection, of that Cuban identity, of wanting to then include this in a Cuban identity. Though historically, Cuba has always had a multiracial identity. Jose Marti Park, going back to Jose Marti, having a multiracial identity is part of building the idea of Cuba as a nation. It's just that the idea of being a multiracial nation, mulata nation, and the actual valuing of black people are two different things.
When you have a more subtle racism, it's a little more, you can always say, we're not racist because we don't do this and this and this. So then it's almost easier to continue in that way. So even though there was a lot more commingling, or at least it could look like that to the onlooker, maybe deep down there wasn't as much commingling.
I'm a person that's part of my culture. I love having all these different flavors running through my blood. But think about it. Again, we go far back to what is supposed to be the dominant race? White. So they can't, Chinese are immigrants, Spanish are immigrants, blacks are immigrants, so everything else is immigrant except the white. So you're going to attach to what's supposed to prosper. So they're in denial. Even if they have features of an African culture, of a Chinese culture, they're going to be in denial because that's not the ultimate race.
We can't cover our nation's issues with a finger and say, oh no, it doesn't exist anymore. It does. It has always been a little easier to accomplish certain things if you come from a true bloodline, if you come from, a different economic standpoint, if you are a padrinao, as everyone says. That's regardless of what country you come from.
People kind of adapt to the dynamics of the society here too, and they sometimes play the game. So yeah, you're still Cuban, you have certain values of your culture, but you want to fit in. It's about fitting in all the time. That's why people prefer to say, well, blacks are not the same as these blacks, or we whites are not the same as these whites, or because people try to fit in at all costs.
Cubans came at the right place at the right time. 1960s Miami was rift with racial tensions of white and black Americans during the era of the emerging civil rights movement. Although foreign to the customs and ways of the US and barely speaking the language, Cubans did, however, come in large masses as a predominantly white ethnic community. This allowed for what sociologists term passing, that gave white Cuban immigrants leverage within the white American separatist establishment in an undeveloped Miami, as well as access to resources such as property and employment.
It sounds messed up to say this, but maybe since they had a lighter shade on their skin. It allowed them to fit into society here in America a little bit easier.
Perhaps we've had a little more success because we don't seem or look Hispanic, Mexican even, because we can blend in with white bread America.
And because to some degree the middle class in Cuba were white and the upper classes were white, well, those were the first to immigrate, and then immigration closed. And so there is this racial tug that occurred in 1980 when the boatlift came, and a huge percentage of the arrivals were of mixed blood descendancy. And that now continues to move forward. And when you look at Cuba and its history, you see that the largest group is mixed race. You still look at the communist leadership, and by and large, they're overwhelmingly white. That said, and you look at Miami, it's the same thing.
When my mother came in the 50s, she was in downtown Miami, and there were 2 water fountains in front of the Woolworths, the 5 and dime. And one said for colored and one said for white. And my mother said, whoa, I don't know. Let me get out of here. I'm not even going to make that choice. I'm getting out of here.
America, in past, used to lend itself to great discrimination and had the legal fortitude to maintain discrimination. Thanks God that's gone from this country. But look, the Europeans came over. Okay? And they started to take over. I take it that being white of pure quality might mean something to them. They also went to Cuba. The Spaniards went to Cuba. And being white gives you a certain amount of power that being black does not.
I remember when I first went to get my driver's license, my restricted driver's license when I was 16 years old, the lady, it was an African American, she put as race as white. I'm like, excuse me, I'm not white. She goes, but you ain't black either. I'm like, what do you mean I'm not black? She goes, look at your nose, you're not, look at your lips. I'm like, wait a second, she goes, son, don't argue with me, okay? You're white. And I'm like, oh. Okay, whatever. So I came back home and I told my mom, guess what? I'm white. Here, it says it on my driver's license. An African American lady that took care of me at the driver's license office, she says I'm white.
Cubans should not necessarily consider themselves white per se. I mean, what is a white person? Is a wasp? Is that a white person? Because most Cubans are a rainbow within themselves, within their own family. If they were to go back to the generations, through generations and generations, they will find that within their own family, even if they're so-called white-looking, they're going to realize that they have everything within their own family.
Racially, Latinos can be Native, Indigenous, they could be African, they could be Chinese, they could be Arabs, they could be Jews, they could be every combination that you can imagine, because all of those peoples have been to those countries and laid down roots.
What we think of as black or brown or white varies from country to country and culture to culture, and then how racism functions based on those definitions and those categories of racial identity is going to vary from country to country. But that's one of the most shocking, especially for black Cubans. That's one of the most shocking things for them to encounter when they come to the United States in particular, because many, and there's been some work documenting this, many feel extremely marginalized by the Cuban American community here and end up gravitating more to the African American community, because at least while there they feel maybe culturally marginalized, at least racially they're accepted.
Now I run into a lot of people, a lot of Cubans that have come from Cuba recently, within a year or 2 years or 3 years ago, and when they meet me, they're like, let me ask you a question. What's the problem? Because they actually are quite disgusted with the fact that the white Cuban American treats the black Cuban American the way that they do, because for them, they're all Cuban on the island, and that's how they've expressed it to me. So the gap and the race problem between the black and the white Cuban American is just the gap of people not knowing because we haven't been back to our island. So it's a gap in our history, and it's a gap in our culture, and it was something that was never spoken.
That's why for me, if I were like darker skinned, I don't know that I would live in Miami.
I feel like I don't belong here. I feel like I'm not connected here. And it has nothing to do, and you would think I would be more connected because I'm Cuban, and no, I do not relate.
But as we sit in Afro-Cuban groups and speak, you have a sense that their immigration did not provide all of the benefits that this country could offer. And much as that is because of the internal discrimination that we Cubans have created. We've taken that negative side of America and maximized it as a controlling factor that has created division.
I do think, however, that white Cuban Americans, we do have a lot of miles to go before we really understand relations between the races. There is an undercurrent of, if not racism, of prejudice among Cubans here and on the island.
You know, I think to some degree that is an unresolved thing in Cuba, therefore it's an unresolved thing in the Cuban American community. And there is no question that race is a component of the community. Could we have handled it better? There's no question about that.
During the evolution of Miami's ascendancy to international prominence from a once sleepy tourist town to a major metropolitan city, Miami has been infamous and notorious as a leading base of illegal drug trafficking into the United States. According to declassified government information, during the 1960s and early 1970s, marijuana was a primary import drug into the region. But during the 1970s, marijuana imports were replaced by the much more lucrative cocaine imports. Cocaine during these times was heavily imported from Colombia straight into the port of Miami. Some hold that much of the economic growth which took place in Miami during this time period was a benefit of the drug trade. As members of the drug trade made immense amounts of money, the money flowed in large amounts into legitimate businesses. As a result, drug money indirectly financed the construction of many of the modern high-rise buildings and skyscrapers that make up the Miami Beach condo scene and the downtown Miami skyline.
The downside of Miami is that it's a rat race.
I always say, look at Cuba, look at Miami. Why? I say, well, we can't govern either one of the two very well. The old joke of the guy walking down the street and pulls out a gun and says, give me your money. He says, I'm the mayor. He said, I'm sorry, give me my money. Miami's a young city. That's the problem. From a historical perspective, we're teenagers. We've grown up very quickly.
Corruption, as you know, is a world plague. Corruption is everywhere. I would say that's the number one evil in practically every country. The so-called white-collar crime is very, very prevalent everywhere. Miami was no exception to that.
We have had our share of corruption and crime in our city. At one point, we were, I believe, if I don't remember, maybe I'm mistaken, the #1 crime city in the nation. Whenever there is power corrupts people. For one, it's inevitable.
Miami had its identity before. Miami was a playground. Then the Cubans came here, and then we became, the cocaine capital of the world. That was one of the identities we gave Miami. Well, the Colombians helped too, but that's another thing. So did the Peruvians. But I mean, we've given a lot of good things to this community and a lot of great things to this community. We've gotten some stuff that's pretty shitty too.
The Cuban American story is very much a tragic comedy because On the one hand, you have the tragedy of exile, of being uprooted, of loss, of lost family, of lost careers, lost fortunes, broken up families, families divided because of politics.
Being from Miami and having that Cuban background, I know what it is for people to become jaded, and that really is something that passes on from generation to generation.
You are caged to your environment, and I think it's almost this tragedy for Cubans that they have escaped this island to just find their own mentally and culturally made island.
Hindsight's always 20/20. I think that, as we look back, we look at where we were and what we are, you can spend a lot of time talking about all the great things that have happened. But in between here and here, there was a whole lot of tragedy that my family went through, that every Cuban family went through.
It's a comedy because, comedies always end happily and well. And it's a comedy because, on the one hand, so many of these people would never have achieved materially, in terms of position, in terms of education, would never have achieved what they've achieved in this country while in Cuba. Of course, and the story hasn't ended. It never ends, really. It continues.
The notion of the Cuban community as an extremely successful community, in which the individuals are successful, is become almost now a stereotype.
It would be very useful to kind of really expand this definition of, first of all, what we think a Cuban person is. I think there are a lot of really narrow narratives of what we think a Cuban person is. And also maybe expand our definition of what an exile and refugee and immigrant are. I mean, really, I think we might be kind of all of them at the same time, and it's really fluid.
It's important in talking about Cubans in the United States in the 21st century to realize that it's becoming increasingly difficult to generalize about Cubans. The traditional image of Cubans in the United States is rooted primarily in the migration that arrived in the early 60s, which essentially came from Cuba's upper socioeconomic sectors, which had relative success in the U.S., and which carried with them what we call an exile mentality, that is, the notion of a return or at least a recovery of the homeland. As time has gone on, and we're talking now about nearly half a century of time, there have been other waves of Cubans that have been coming in, and therefore it has become more and more difficult to generalize about the entire Cuban American experience based upon the image or the stereotype, if you will, of the Cubans who arrived earlier. So it becomes much more important to say, as I do in an article that I co-authored, there are Cubans and there are Cubans and there are Cubans. That is, it is not just a monolithic story, neither politically, nor economically, nor socially.
All of these folks don't blend that smoothly together in the community. Looking at it from the outside, they might look all the same.
The Cuban American today is very different than the Cuban that came here 40 years ago. And the Cuban that comes here tomorrow will be very different than the Cuban American that's made Miami home.
Most of the people that know about the cafe, they know that this is a very open-minded, liberal, progressive place where we can speak differently. I mean, the dissenting is I think, an invigorating exercise for the mind. For me, I opened it because I had this concept of a coffee house, and for years I had been thinking about it, and then, one day I said, well, I'm going to do it, because if I don't do it, somebody's going to do it, and then I'm not going to feel good about it. So my brother needed to do something. I kind of told him, let's do it together, and I opened it up. Always, my intent was for this place to be a cultural, a place where you could, culturally explore and have conversations that were possibly not had anywhere else in Miami, especially on the Cuba issue. So I opened in 2005, and what I like about opening the cafe is it also marked for me that Miami has changed very much, because this cafe, I cannot call it a Cuban cafe. It is a new Miami cafe, because what I see here is the face of the new Miami. Before it was just Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Americans. Now it's Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Americans, Colombians, Chilenos, Paraguayos, Brasileiros, the whole South America. And I see it here every day with who sits at the counter, the conversations we have. We not only talk about Fidel all the time, which we always do, we talk about Chavez, and we talk about Evo Morales, and we talk about what's going on in South America, and we talk about that. So 10 years ago, it would have been more like the Cuban cafe, but now it's the new Miami. It's a very interesting evolution.
I think Miami is evolving, and I think actually right now it's going through a renaissance, and you can feel it. There's a heightened sense of energy on the streets.
There's a re-Cubanization of Miami going on intensely.
What has happened is that the combination of those factors, that is unauthorized migration, in addition to the 20,000 or so a year, has resulted in a sustained wave since 1995. So if you look at the figures from the Immigration Naturalization Service, you will see, for example, that in years like 2004, 2005, 2006, there were anywhere between 20 and 40,000 visas, that is, immigrant visas issued to Cubans in the U.S. And which means that when the decade of the 2000s ends, whether you want to end it in 2009 or 2010, but it doesn't matter, that decade will be the highest in terms of the number of people arriving from Cuba, higher than the 1960s, higher than the 1970s. And that is something that a lot of people don't realize, which is the extent to which the Cuban community is changing with new arrivals, to the extent to which Miami is changing with new arrivals. And it'll raise the Cuban population in Miami particularly substantially, much more than people anticipate, I think.
We look back at history, never happened before, where, from the 50s to 50 years later, you're still having waves of immigrants?
It becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where you say, well, you build it and they will come. You build this Cuban enclave, you build a Spanish enclave, and then they will come. And that's what's happening now. They just keep coming and coming.
There's 20,000 plus Cubans arriving in Miami every year, legally, from Cuba. There are others coming from different parts of the world arriving in Miami. You're going to see a new generation of Cubans, not necessarily Cuban Americans, getting involved in politics, but different type of politics, which is, I think, what we need, with a different message, with a message that is more adapted to our reality today, with a message that may include even the fact that, we are Cubans, we're proud to be Cubans, we're proud to have led the way for other, immigrants to come into this wonderful and beautiful community, and experience their dream or follow their American way of life and so forth and so on, but a message of unity to where this is not this is Miami, but Miami is not Cuba. We're going to open the door to other immigrants. We're going to speak about the issues in Venezuela. We're going to talk about the issues that affect other immigrants from Latin America, from Venezuela, from Colombia, from Peru, that lives within our community, whose issues needs to be addressed. And that's the Miami that I'm hoping that we'll see within the next 5 years.
People are watching us. There's been a lot of media coverage on young Cuban Americans, especially in these last couple of years. And I think people are expecting great things from us. And I hope we can follow in the footsteps of our successful forebears and to build upon it.
The generations are going to evolve. Where the identity of that generation is going to evolve as well. Where instead of seeing themselves as a Cuban that came to America, or American Cuban American, or American Cuban, or American, of Cuban descent, as that evolves, as that changes, the Cuban experience is still going to be here. Only it's not going to be the same.
But without a doubt, this is going to evolve into, much more of a
cosmopolitan Latin city, and I think that's what we're seeing today, than strictly a Cuban American city.
The Cubans, left the soil pretty fertilized throughout this community for other Latin American brothers and sisters.
And I think Miami is a perfect example of that. And it's a perfect example how prosperous it is, because it has prospered with this multi-ethnic type of development. I think that's been a very key issue here and why it is what it is today. A very cosmopolitan town, kind of a mecca of Central and South America, of the Latin world blending in with the Anglo-Saxon world. So I think it would be a model that should be shared throughout the country.
Miami ranks third among the nation's 100 largest cities in the share of a non-white Caucasian population, with an estimated 88% of its residents considered non-white. As a result, the 2000 census gave Miami the designation of a majority-minority city. But interesting questions lie ahead for Miami, Florida, like what will happen to the Cuban enclave in the near future? Will Cubans still make up the majority population group in the greater Miami region for years to come? How will Miami continue to evolve as the internationally renowned city that it is in this era of globalization? A Miami Herald article once proclaimed, "Miami is the city where America's future first arrived."
What you see in Miami is a unique experiment that many cities will be going through. And we have found strength in our diversity. We have capitalized on our diversity. And rather than seeing that as something which is not good or is anti-American or this or that, it's the opposite here.
If you believed in some kind of divine intervention, it was Miami and this Cuban population 50 years ago that really created this gateway and a bridge between all of the Americas. And so now we've become a great, gateway, not only for business, but for new cultures, for families, for residents, for industry, and the whole banking industry, for instance, the whole financial services industry. And it became much larger than just Miami and Cuba. We became, I guess, the global success story, that if we can work here at that time, it can work anywhere in the world. And it just takes an embracing, receptive country to a new culture.
Miami actually became first a global city before it became a relevant U.S. city. Miami was still, and even to this day, in terms of just sheer size, population, it's nothing compared to a New York or LA or Chicago. And yet, we are mentioned in the same breath in many occasions with other significantly large, much larger cities in America because of our global image and standing.
The reason why Miami has become such an important place for commerce and trade and international banking is because of our ability to speak several languages, is because of our ability and know-how of the cultures south of Miami. And even the Europeans and all that are placing their headquarters for this hemisphere in Miami because of a labor force that is available that is very attuned to the realities of the world today. So if we continue to capitalize on that, I think that Miami has a great future.
Well, Miami has been a city that in its 114 years of existence has gone through many issues, from violent hurricanes to riots, to crime waves, to cocaine cowboys. Miami has seen it all and has survived. It's, I believe, it's a city that cannot be sunk. It's a city that is a survival.
There's no doubt that this is the greatest country in the world, and what it's offered Cubans is the opportunity to repair their lives, give their families an opportunity to become educated, to succeed, to be able to get the kind of
productivity that anybody wants for their family.
I am another example of my people's triumphs, of my people's sacrifice. I'm gonna self-proclaim myself the poster child of the Cuban experience.
The Cuban American experience is one of the most wonderful stories, illustrations of the American dream.
My life's always been the American dream. It's what you see on TV.
The American dream is alive and kicking here in Miami.
The history of America is the history of immigrants. It's that, and Cuban Americans are a chapter in that book.
But I think the Cuban story, for me, is the American story. And the American story is this idea that you come here with nothing, you work hard, you reach economic success, and you're accepted into the larger society, no matter whether you speak with an accent or you're brown or you're black or you're white. It's the Horatio Aguirre's story. That myth is, I think, the real Cuban American story, which is the same for Irish Americans, for African Americans, for all Americans. Is this idea that if you work hard and you play by the rules, you're going to be rewarded.
But we're not the only ones that have done it. And that is the American story. And we can't forget that in America, because that's the fuel that keeps us going. That's why you can't close these doors. That's why you want somebody that fights like hell to get into this country, because that's the spirit you need. That's what makes it work. De Tocqueville saw it when this country was being first created in the 18th century. You see it today, and you can't take that away. That's the beauty of what Miami and this America is. Miami, to me, is more American than any other city in this country. It is what America is. Bring people from all over who have a constitution, make it work.
The Cuban story is just part of the mosaic of America. It's perhaps the most vivid revelation of what America is all about. This is something that anyone who has read the history of this nation is very much aware that everything that is great about America was because of an immigrant or an immigrant group that helped bring about it.
We're still fresh in the minds of people that what an immigrant can do to create a community.
I think we're the living experiment that made it, that we've succeeded. And I think that even though we'll travel throughout the world and we'll own homes in other places, I think Cubans, for the most part, will see Miami as really their home away from home, and as generations grow, I think more even of the Cuban immigrant population will start to see Miami as really its home. It's going to be interesting when the island of Cuba opens up to see what kind of renovation, rehabilitation, revitalization, rejuvenation, whatever you want to say, what it's really going to happen. But I think Miami will maintain probably its Cuban identity.
The cool thing about it is that I'm from Miami. I'm not a product of Cuba. I'm a product of Miami. You want the Miami story, you want the case, you have it here. The girl who was born in Miami, who grew up on Goya products.
You can take the Cuban out of Miami, but you can't take Miami out of the Cuban.
Today, the city of Miami has the second highest share of foreign-born residents in the nation, totaling 60% of the population. Over 20% of these residents are estimated to have arrived within the last 5 years. With 10% of the island's population having left Cuba in 50 years and in the process created a home away from home, and with approximately 25,000 Cubans arriving legally and illegally to Miami every year, Miami stands as a continuing Cuban American story.
There was a time where bumper stickers, people communicated through bumper stickers. And then there was a group of people
who were making this bumper sticker very popular that said, "Will the last American leaving South Florida please bring the flag?" And well, the Cubans came up with their own bumper sticker that says, "Don't worry, your flag will still be here when you get back." So it was a lot of tension, but it was growing pains in the assimilation of this people that was coming at that time. Everyone who comes to this country for the first time in groups, in numbers, is faced with, I guess, an initiation of resistance.
There were these two Indians sitting on Plymouth Rock, and they saw the Mayflower come in, and one looked at the other and said, "Oh shit, boat people. We're all immigrants." Immigration is what fuels this nation. It is the intellectual engine, it is the emotional engine, it is the engine of passion that comes in. A recent immigrant to this country will take a dishwashing job as an entry-level position. A person that's been in this country maybe 5th, 6th generation will take the same job and say it's a dead-end job. They have the attitude, they have the desire to make it better.
For a generation, my generation, to see the difference of coming to a country and being able to be a huge part of the development of the area within that country that you live, I think is a huge statement, is a huge thing that sometimes we don't really realize that until I guess we're talking about it like in this documentary.
Pedro Jose Greer, Jr. Dr. Pedro Jose Joe Greer, Jr. has devoted his career to improving medical services for the uninsured. A native of Miami, he followed his passion for helping others to medical school and founded the Cumulus Health Concern, CHC, in 1984 as a medical intern. Today, CHC treats thousands of homeless patients a year, serving as a model clinic for the poor and inspiring physicians everywhere to work with indigent populations. Dr. Greer's tremendous contributions to the South Florida community and our nation as a whole stand as a shining example of the difference one person can make in the lives of many.
Cuban Americans have been very successful in the United States. There is virtually no endeavor in America where you don't find a Cuban American who has succeeded. In the arts, in the sciences, in politics, in business, in academia, you name it, and you will find some Cuban American success story that's a tribute to America and a tribute to our community. But I want you to understand that for every one of those stories, there are thousands of people who came here when they were young with huge dreams and hopes, dreams like the ones you have for yourself right now, who found those dreams became impossible. Not because they were less worthy, not because they're any less intelligent than you are, but simply because the circumstances of their lives made it impossible for them to fulfill. When you're 25 years old and you are uprooted from the land of your birth to another place where you have to learn the language and earn a living, it's difficult to go to law school or medical school or architecture school or any school for that matter. You're thrown into life and before you know it, you're 65 years of age. Quickly, tomorrows become yesterdays. I say this to you because I think one of the great untold stories of our community, and one that I hope you will honor in your lives, is the story of the generations that precede us. Of these brave men and women who came to this country and were unable to fulfill their dreams. And so they made it the mission of their lives to ensure that their children and their grandchildren could do all the things they could. Now I say that to you knowing that that is not a unique Cuban story. That is the story of America. It is above all else the essence of our country, the notion that every parent wants to leave their child better off than themselves.
It's a story that doesn't have an ending yet. So 10 years from now, you and I could sit down and then perhaps summarize everything and say, well, you know, were we really successful? You cannot say, oh, the success of the Cuban American community, because in order for us to be completely successful, you know, we have to include, you know, our fellow Cubans in the island. We have to complete our story by doing everything we can to be able to provide and to be able to better the way of being of our Cuban people in the island. So our story is not a story of success yet. Our story is yet to be written, and it's the ending that is going to define whether we Cubans that live abroad or the so-called exile community in Miami is a success story or not.